Her knees had passed beyond pain into something colder, as though the stone of the floor had begun, slowly, across 2 years, to claim her for its own. The flags of the scullery were wet under her raw hands, and the water in the bucket had gone grey and scummed with ash. Again, the voice came from the doorway, sharp as a dropped knife. "You've missed the corner. You always miss the corner. I do wonder, did father send you to that costly finishing school so you might learn to scrub like a half-wit? Or did that talent come to you on its own?" Tabitha did not look up. She had learned, across 2 years, that to look up was only to invite more. Her sister Bryony stood framed in the doorway in primrose silk, a baroness now, married and risen and gone, returned to her childhood home for the single pleasure of watching the girl who had once outshone her crawl across a floor. "Lower," Bryony said softly, and there was a smile folded into the word like a blade into velvet. "There. You look almost natural down there, as though God had made you for it." And then the silk rustled away, and Tabitha knelt alone in the grey cold with the grey water, and did not weep, for weeping, too, was a thing she had given up, the way one gives up a habit that has stopped repaying its cost. Welcome back to the Duke's Revenge. I've been waiting to share this story with you. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Whether you're curled up warm in bed, out on your morning commute, or stealing a quiet half-hour from the clamour of the day, I'd love to know. Drop your city and your local time in the comments below. I read everyone, and watching this community stretch across oceans and time zones and the small hours of 100 different nights is the great, quiet joy of my days. She had nothing. He had everything. Society said the two of them could never be equals, that a man who owned the better part of 3 counties and held the private ear of half of Parliament does not turn his head twice for a girl with cracked hands and ash beneath her broken nails. But when a duke decides that he wants something or someone, there is no force in all of England powerful enough to stand between him and the having of it. Tonight's story is about a young woman who fell from a drawing room to a scullery in the space of 2 years, who was made to labour as a drudge in the very house her own father had left her, and about the man who had not, in all the long cold decade between, contrived for a single night to forget the girl she had been before the falling. He had watched her once, across a candle-lit room, when they were both far younger, and the world was a kinder shape. He had never once stopped. So let me take you to Hartcombe House, in the green and grey county of Derbyshire, in the cold, reluctant spring of 1853. To a girl upon her knees on a scullery floor, and to the long, patient, devastating revenge that was already, though she had no way of knowing it, turning up the muddy road toward her door. Tabitha Merrow had not always belonged to the floors. There is a particular cruelty in falling, rather than in being born to a low place, for the fall leaves you with the memory of warmth, and the memory of warmth is what makes the cold the colder. It was a cruelty her stepmother had studied and refined and raised to an art. Until the age of 19, Tabitha had been the eldest and cleverest daughter of Mr. Gerald Merrow, a gentleman of comfortable fortune and gentler disposition, master of Hartcombe, and its £2,000 a year. She had worn sprigged muslin and danced 2 London seasons. She had been, by every account that signified, a young lady of intelligence and prospects, perhaps a little too quick in her wit for the marriage market, perhaps a little too apt to say the true thing rather than the smooth one, but handsome, well dowered, and kind to the bone. And then her father, who had buried Tabitha's own mother when the girl was 12, and had been lonely ever since, in the patient, uncomplaining way of genuinely good men, made, at 50, the one error of his blameless life. He married a handsome widow named Mrs. Ursula Vane, who came to Hartcombe with 2 grown daughters of her own, a quantity of fine luggage, and a smile that never once, in all the years that followed, reached the cold, pale grey of her eyes. Within a 12-month, Gerald Merrow was dead, taken by a fever that came on a Tuesday, and finished its work by the Sunday, so swift the household had scarcely time to understand it before the blinds were drawn and the bell was tolling across the wet fields. And within a year of that, Tabitha had come to understand, with the creeping horror of a person waking by inches to find the doors already locked, the exact shape of the trap built up around her. Now, it is important, it is the very key to this story, that you understand something about what a woman could and could not possess in the England of 1853, for the whole of Tabitha's misery turned upon this fine point of law. Under the iron doctrine of coverture, a married woman had no separate legal existence. The moment she spoke, her vows, her property, her income, and in the eye of the law her own person, were folded entirely into her husband's. She could own nothing in her own name. But an unmarried woman or a widow stood on different ground. She alone among her sex could hold property outright, and the whole trouble for Tabitha lay in her father's will. Gerald Merrow, trusting, gravely ill, not yet ready to credit that he was dying, had left the management of Hartcombe and the guardianship of his one unmarried daughter in his new wife's hands, to hold until that daughter should marry or attain the age of 25. He had meant it, with the whole of his failing heart, as a protection. Ursula Vane received it across his deathbed as a kingdom. And so when Tabitha stood at her father's graveside, she was not merely a girl who had lost the last soul on earth who loved her. She was an heiress whose entire inheritance had in that same hour acquired a gatekeeper, and that gatekeeper had 2 daughters of her own to settle before ever she would spare a thought for Tabitha. The settling was accomplished with cold efficiency. Ursula's elder daughter, Bryony, was married within 18 months to Lord Crane, a baron possessed of gout and a good income in roughly equal measure. And the Hartcombe accounts, which in their substance were Tabitha's accounts, paid for the wedding breakfast, the trousseau, and the dowry, all 3. The younger, a thin, sharp-tongued creature named Drusilla, was promised the following spring to the son of a neighbouring knight. And Tabitha, whose own dowry, by her father's loving intention, ought to have been the largest and finest of the 3, watched her fortune dispersed in silks and settlements to launch her 2 stepsisters up and out into society, while she herself was, quietly, methodically, without a single voice ever raised in anger, reduced. It began with small economies, each so reasonable on its face that to object would have seemed the act of a peevish, ungrateful girl. There was no need, Ursula observed mildly, for dear Tabitha to keep a lady's maid, the household being so sadly reduced. And might the girl not make herself useful, since she was so often idle? There was no need to engage a new scullery maid when the last one left to be married, not when dear Tabitha had such willing hands. And so, by reasonable inch after reasonable inch, the thing was done. By the second winter, Tabitha rose at 5 in the black cold with the kitchen staff. She blacked the iron grates on her knees until her hands were soot to the wrist. She hauled water up from the well until her shoulders screamed and the skin of her palms split and healed and split again. And she scrubbed the floors of the house that bore her family's name and held her father's bones beneath the church a half-mile off. She slept in an unheated garret above the kitchen, where in deep winter the frost grew white ferns on the inside of the window, and her breath hung above her thin blanket. She ate what the servants ate, when the servants had finished, and the patient genius of the arrangement, the cold genius that kept her there, scrubbing year upon year, when any soul hearing the tale must cry out for her only to leave that dreadful place, was that there was nowhere on the whole face of the earth for the girl to go. A gentlewoman, without money, without a letter of character, and without a single relation who would receive her, had, in 1853, precisely 2 roads open before her feet, the workhouse or the streets, and the second was the shorter and colder road. Ursula Vane had not turned a single key in a single lock. She had merely arranged the shape of the world so that every door, however. Bravely, Tabitha flung it open, gave only back onto the floor. Here it is worth our pausing, for the structure of a great house was its own rigid map of station, as jealously guarded in its way as the peerage itself. And to feel the depth of Tabitha's fall, you must understand where she had landed. A wealthy household ran on a strict hierarchy. At the summit, below only the family, stood the upper servants, butler, housekeeper, cook, lady's maid, valet, grand personages who were themselves waited upon by those below them. Below these came the housemaids and footmen, and below them, at the very foundation of the whole edifice, toiled the scullery maid, the youngest, the lowest, the worst paid, who scoured the blackened pots and was spoken to by almost no one. For the daughter of the house to be set beneath even the scullery maid, given her labour and denied even her small wage and small dignity, was not a recognised station at all. It answered to nothing. It had no name and no precedent. It was a thing Ursula Vane had simply coldly invented, a place fashioned to exist for no purpose under heaven save humiliation. And the other servants, who were not cruel by nature but only frightened for their own precarious places, looked upon Tabitha day after day with a pity so heavy and constant that she had come across 2 years to prefer the open contempt of her stepsisters. For pity reminded her every hour of what she had been and lost. The contempt, at least, asked nothing of her but that she endure it. She was not, however, left entirely friendless below those stairs, and you must know it, for it will matter. The cook, a broad, weathered, red-armed woman named Mrs. Tolly, who had served Gerald Merrow 30 years and remembered Tabitha as a small, dark child stealing warm bread from the corners of her kitchen, contrived 100 small kindnesses where she dared. An extra portion slipped onto the girl's plate. The warmest place by the fire kept open on the bitterest nights. A rough word of comfort delivered sideways, as though she were scolding rather than blessing. And there was a young housemaid besides, a quick, freckled creature named Annie, hardly 17, who alone among the staff still spoke to Tabitha as to a friend, in whispers, in the dark back passages, and who carried scraps of news down from the bright world above stairs the way a sparrow carries crumbs. It was not much, but upon the floor of the world, where one has nothing else, a single something is a very great deal. Keep these 2 souls in mind. They will both matter before we are done. So when Bryony stood in the scullery doorway that grey spring morning and told her kneeling sister she looked almost natural upon the floor, Tabitha simply wrung out her grey cloth, moved without a word to the corner. She had not in fact missed, and waited for the silk to rustle away. It was the only power left to her in the world. The cold, iron power to give the cruelty nothing to feed upon, no flinch and no tear. And she had grown very strong in the wielding of it. But that morning was not ordinary, though Tabitha had no way to know it. That very morning, 12 miles distant across the rolling, rain-dark shoulders of the Derbyshire hills, a letter was being sealed with black wax in the cold study of Aldermere, the ancient seat of Cedric Aldous, Duke of Hawthorne, and the name written on its face, in a hard hand that had practised the discipline of restraint for 11 years, was Mrs. Ursula Vane, Hartcombe House, Derbyshire. Now let me tell you of the Duke, for the rumours of him had reached down even to the scullery, and they ran thus: that he was the wealthiest man in all the north of England, with £40,000 a year and the private ear of half the cabinet; that he had not danced, nor dined in company, nor been seen to smile in society for the better part of a decade; that he had withdrawn to Aldermere after some private grief and become a cold northern legend, a man whose mere displeasure could break a proud family at the knees and whose favour could not be bought at any price under the sky. And this for the simple, terrible reason that he wanted nothing that any living soul beneath him could offer. The matchmaking mothers of 3 counties had given him up as hopeless. The gentleman feared him and courted his good opinion, and never received it. And the truth that not one soul in broad Derbyshire suspected, was that the coldest man in the north of England had spent 11 years thinking in the sleepless small hours of a girl he had met upon exactly one occasion, when he was 23 and she 16, at a country assembly in the last bright summer of her mother's life. He had been a younger son in those days, not yet a duke, his elder brother, yet living and laughing, the great weight of the title still a remote thing that would surely fall on broader shoulders than his. He had stood at the edge of a provincial ballroom in Bakewell, too proud and far too shy to dance, watching the bright, turning company with the guarded grey eyes of a young man who had already learned to expect little of his fellow creatures. And he had watched a dark-haired girl in a simple white gown refuse, plainly, quietly, without fuss, to laugh at a cruel jest the whole rest of the room was laughing at, refuse, and then rise and cross the entire length of that crowded floor beneath the eyes of everyone, to sit herself down beside the jest's stammering, scarlet-faced victim, a gangling boy the company had chosen for its sport. She had spoken to him quietly, of nothing, of horses and the weather and the supper to come, until the dreadful colour faded from his face, and he could lift his head. And Cedric had turned, low, to the man beside him, and asked who she was. "Miss Merrow," came the careless answer. "Merrow of Hartcombe. Clever girl, too clever by half. The pity of it is, she's only a girl. She's the best of that whole family, and it will all go to waste." He had resolved in that moment to cross the room and ask her to dance. But his brother was taken ill that same night, suddenly, badly, and Cedric was sent for and gone. And by the time the long catastrophe of his family had run its course, the brother dead within the year, the dukedom descending on him like a roof beam come down in the dark, the grief and the avalanche of new duty closing over his young head like cold black water over a drowning man. Years had passed, and he had told himself sternly and often, and at last with bleak success, that the girl in white was a thing of the vanished past, a softness a man in his new position could not afford to keep. He had told himself precisely that for 11 years, and then, some 3 weeks before the morning our story opens, his land steward happened to mention to him, idly, amid drier business, that the Merrow girl over at Hartcombe, "You'll not recall her, your grace. No reason you should, and had come to a sad and shameful pass. That the widow Vane had the whole running of the estate now, and had reduced the late master's own daughter to common service, the scrubbing and hauling like the lowest drudge, and that it was indeed the quiet scandal of every servants' hall in the district, the gentleman's daughter brought to her knees in her father's house, and something deep within the Duke of Hawthorne, something that had lain frozen solid for 11 winters, cracked all at once, clean down its centre, with a sound he did not so much hear as feel. He did not ride for Hartcombe in a rage. That was not his way, and a rage would not have served his ends. A man of 40,000 a year does not rescue, with all the heat and mess and dangerous incompleteness the word carries. He acquires so thoroughly, so finally, past all undoing, that the thing once gained can never be taken from him again. So he did not ride. He wrote a letter. And the letter, which Ursula Vane was to read 3 full times that morning, a slow flush of incredulous delight mounting in her sallow cheeks, requested in the smoothest terms the honour of waiting upon her household, and intimated in the careful language of a man who knew to the inch what he was about, that he had begun at last to turn his mind toward the question of his marrying, and had heard her household numbered among it ladies of suitable quality. Ursula Vane did not, for a single beat of her heart, imagine the Duke might mean Tabitha. And why should she? In the cold architecture of Ursula's mind, Tabitha had long ago ceased to be a lady at all. She had become a fixture, a grey and kneeling fact of the household's lower regions, no more a candidate for a duchess's coronet than the scrubbing brush in her hand. Ursula thought instead of Drusilla, her own younger daughter, not yet safely married, sharp and presentable, and conveniently between betrothals, and saw her whole future rise and rearrange itself into shining heaps of gold. She did not even trouble to tell Tabitha the Duke was expected. She had the girl told nothing, and on the appointed afternoon she sent her out, in her grey drudge's dress, to scrub down the broad stone front steps, that the great place might present its best face to its noble visitor. Never dreaming the visitor's carriage might come up the drive while the true daughter of the house was yet on her knees at the very door. That is precisely what came to pass, and I want you to hold the whole picture quite still in your mind a moment, because it is the hinge on which the entire weight of this story turns. The Duke of Hawthorn's carriage, black, severe, unmarked by any crest, drawn by 4 matched and steaming greys, came up the long Hartcombe Drive at 3:30 on a cold and brilliant afternoon, the bare black branches of the limes stark against a hard, washed blue sky. And the first thing its single passenger saw, as the iron-shod wheels slowed and crunched on the gravel, was a young woman in a coarse grey servant's dress, down on her knees on the cold stone steps, a scrubbing brush gripped in one reddened and cracking hand, a single loose strand of dark hair fallen across a face he had not laid eyes on in 11 years, and had never once, in all that time, contrived to forget. She looked up at the sound of the wheels, and their eyes met across the cold, bright air, and Cedric Aldous, Duke of Hawthorn, the coldest man in all the north of England, felt his whole carefully frozen world tilt slowly, sickeningly, irrevocably upon its axis, because the girl in the white gown was still in there, plainly, unmistakably, undefeated, behind all the exhaustion and the ash and the reddened, ruined hands, looking out steadily at him with the very same dark, level, unfrightened eyes that had crossed a Bakewell ballroom 11 years before to sit beside a stammering boy. He did not descend at once. He found, to his own faint astonishment, that he could not. He sat still within the stopped carriage and looked at her, and she, not knowing him in the least, seeing only some great lord come to call upon her stepmother, and shamed to the marrow to be discovered so, on her knees, in her grey rags, looked back for one long moment, then dropped her gaze, and gathered up her brush and bucket to remove her unworthy self from his lordship's path. No. The word formed within him with a violence that startled him. He opened the carriage door himself before the footman could come round to it. "Don't move," he said. Tabitha froze where she knelt. The voice was low and absolutely certain, the voice of a man so long accustomed to being obeyed that obedience had become to him a law of nature, like the falling of a dropped stone. And she found she had obeyed it before she understood she was doing so. The gentleman stepped down onto the gravel. He was tall, severely dressed in black, perhaps 34, with a hard, handsome, guarded face, and grey eyes fixed upon her now with an intensity that frightened her far more than any open anger. She did not know what he wanted of her. She braced herself by the bitter instinct of 2 years for cruelty, because cruelty was what attention had come to mean. "Your Grace." Ursula Vane's voice came sailing down the steps, bright and trembling with welcome, and behind it the anxious rustle of Drusilla's best silk. "You honour us beyond anything we— Oh, but do forgive the girl, your Grace. She was only just finishing. She shall be gone in an instant. Drusilla, my love, come down and make your curtsy to his Grace." "Who is this?" said the Duke. He had not looked away from the kneeling girl. A small, brittle silence fell. Ursula's bright smile flickered like a candle in a draught. This? Why, this is no one at all, your grace, merely one of the servants. She was at the cleaning of the—" "Her name," said the Duke. It was not a request, and it was not loud, and it stopped Ursula's busy tongue more completely than any shout could have done. And Tabitha Merrow, kneeling there with her ruined hands and her one fallen strand of dark hair, looked up into the grey, searching eyes of this perfect stranger, and felt for the first time in 2 grinding years something for which she had no name. The strange, shaking, almost unbearable sensation of being seen, not glanced past, not looked through, not pitied, and not despised. Seen. She lifted her chin a fraction from the stone. "Tabitha Merrow," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "Daughter of the late Mr. Gerald Merrow, who was the master of this house." The Duke smiled then, a small, terrible, deeply satisfied smile that Ursula Vane, watching from above, did not understand, and would very shortly come to dread. "Yes," he said quietly, and for the kneeling girl alone. "I know exactly who you are." And then to Ursula, without turning his head from Tabitha, "Madam, I believe you and I have a very great deal to discuss. I have to pause here, my friends, and tell you something. For when I first sat with this scene, the woman upon her knees, and the silent man who had carried her face in his breast for 11 years stepping down into the cold to say, 'Don't move,' I had to rise from my chair and walk away from my desk a good while before I could go on. Because there is something in being recognized, truly named, truly witnessed, truly claimed as real and present and worthy, at the lowest moment, when the whole world has quietly agreed to treat you as a stick of the furniture, that goes streaking past every wall we ever built, and strikes the deepest and most defenseless part of us. We will come back to it. For recognition, you must understand, was only the very beginning of what the Duke of Hawthorne had come all that way to do. What passed within the drawing-room that afternoon, Tabitha was not permitted to hear. She was sent back to the kitchen, shaking, while the Duke sat closeted with her stepmother the better part of an hour. But a great house has ears in every wall, and the staff of Hartcombe had every reason to love Tabitha, and none to love Ursula Vane. So by evening the warm kitchen had assembled the whole story from its scattered pieces, carried down in fragments by Annie. The Duke had not proposed for Drusilla. The Duke had not so much as turned his head to look upon Drusilla, who had stood waiting in her best silk with her curtsy half made and abandoned. The Duke had instead inquired with a chilling, unhurried courtesy that made Ursula's clasped hands go cold in her lap, into the whole management of the Merrow estate, the accounts, the disbursements, the precise terms of the late Mr. Merrow's will, and had let it be understood that he took a deep and personal interest in the welfare and future of the late gentleman's elder daughter. And then he had risen, announced he would call again, often, and was gone down the drive before Ursula could gather her wits to prevent him. Ursula Vane was many wicked things, but she was never a stupid woman, and stupidity was never among her sins. She understood, sitting alone as the light failed, that something had gone catastrophically wrong with her fine afternoon, and she understood with cold certainty that the something was Tabitha. And so that night, for the first time in 2 years, she came down herself to the kitchen, descended into the warm, crowded, suddenly silent room where the staff took their late supper, and crossed to where Tabitha sat, alone at the table's foot, and took the girl's chin in hard, cold fingers, and forced her face to the light. "I do not know what you said to him," she said, low and dripping venom, for Tabitha's ear alone, though the whole still kitchen held its breath, nor by what low cunning you contrive to be seen on those steps. But you will put it out of your foolish head this instant. A duke does not marry a scullery drudge, you dreaming creature. He is amusing himself with a novelty, as great idle men do, and when the novelty wears thin, and it will within the month, you will still be here, on this floor where you belong, until I am laid cold in my grave. Do you understand me?" Tabitha understood her perfectly, but she had also seen in that same moment, watching her stepmother's face from below, as she had learned across 2 years to watch every face from below, from the floor, where no one troubles to guard their expression. Something she had never once seen there before. Something that changed, quietly and forever, the balance between them. She had seen fear. Far back, behind the cold, pale grey of the eyes, moving like a slow fish beneath river ice. Fear. Ursula Vane was afraid of her. It was a very small thing and well hidden. But Tabitha, who noticed everything, took it and pressed it away into a hidden seam of herself, the way a shipwrecked woman presses away a single found coin against the day she shall have nothing else. For Tabitha had always noticed everything. It was the one possession 2 years of scrubbing had failed to strip from her. The one thing they could not take, because it lived behind her dark eyes, where none of them thought to look. Invisible on her knees in every room, she had watched the secret, unguarded life of Hartcombe flow past her, as though she were a feature of the wainscoting. And she had seen things. She had seen the steward, a soft-handed, increasingly uneasy man named Mr. Pollard, arrive on each quarter day and depart by the side door in close, anxious conference with her stepmother. She had seen the small locked drawer in the late master's study desk, the one Ursula kept always locked and would suffer no servant near. She had heard, scrubbing the flags outside that study door with her ear half turned to the keyhole, the word settlement spoken low, and the word trustee, and a particular nervous, brittle little laugh her stepmother gave only when the subject in the closed room was money. She had filed every fragment away without yet knowing why, because a woman upon the floor of the world has nothing to do but watch and listen and remember. And Tabitha had been watching for 2 long years. The Duke came again, exactly as he had promised, but 4 days later, and this time asked to walk a while in the gardens, and asked, to Ursula's barely throttled fury, that Miss Merrow might accompany him. Not Drusilla, Miss Merrow, and Ursula Vane could no more refuse a duke to his face in her own hall than refuse the turning tide. So Tabitha was hastily, resentfully got up in one of Drusilla's grudgingly lent cast-off gowns, a faded blue thing, 2 seasons out of the mode, but clean and whole and 1,000 miles from grey rags, her cracked hands hidden in borrowed gloves, her dark hair pinned up hurriedly by Annie's quick, delighted fingers. And she was sent out into the cold, bright, formal garden upon the arm of the most feared man in England, while her stepmother watched from the drawing-room window like a hawk that has seen its captive prey lift suddenly, silently, impossibly away into the open sky. They walked a while in silence at first, down the gravelled path between the bare, thorny, sleeping rose-beds, the Duke shortening his long stride to hers without seeming to weigh it. Then he said, not looking at her, his grey eyes on the middle distance, "You don't remember me? From before?" "No, Your Grace," she had decided, kneeling in the kitchen the night before, upon honesty. She had nothing left to lose by it, and honesty cost a penniless woman nothing. 11 years ago, an assembly at Bakewell. You wore a white gown and you crossed the whole length of a crowded room to sit beside a boy everyone was laughing at." He paused, and she saw a muscle move once in the hard line of his jaw. "I have thought of it in the years since far more often than I can account for, either to you or to myself." Tabitha stopped walking. She turned and looked up at him. At the hard, guarded, handsome face that was not, she saw now with a small interior shock, cruel at all, but only guarded, shut up, barred from within, exactly as her own face had learned to shut and bar itself. I remember the assembly, she said slowly, feeling her way. And I remember the boy, Mr. Finch his name was. He stammered dreadfully, and they were merciless. But I do not remember you at all. No, you wouldn't. I never danced. I stood the whole evening at the wall. Something that was nearly, but did not quite become. A smile touched the hard mouth and was gone. I have regretted that I did not cross the room and ask you, Miss Merrow, with a steadiness that has rather astonished me, for 11 years. They came, as he spoke, to a place where the gravel was heaved up by the root of an old cedar, and a slick of black ice yet lay in the hollow where the morning sun had not reached. And Tabitha, in her unfamiliar borrowed half-boots, her eyes upon his face and not her feet, caught her toe against the broken edge and slipped. It was nothing. The smallest stumble. The work of half a second. But his hand was there before she had begun to fall, his gloved hand closing, sure and swift about her own gloved one, his other coming beneath her elbow, righting her. "Steady," he said, low. And then, the danger past, he did not at once let go. For the space of 2 breaths his gloved fingers remained closed, warm about hers upon the cold path, and Tabitha felt that small, innocent, entirely accidental contact run up the length of her arm and into her chest, like the distant ringing note of a struck bell, long after the touch itself was past, long after he had, with a kind of careful deliberateness, released her hand and stepped back, and they had walked on. She had not been touched, she realized, in 2 years, save to be gripped and forced, not once held up, not once caught before she fell. She found her heart was beating in a way she did not understand, and was glad of the cold wind on her face to account for the colour in it. And here, my friends, is where I want to speak to you about the thing this whole story turns upon, about patience and about obsession, and the very thin line between the two, because the Duke of Hawthorne had crossed clean over that line a long time since, and had not the smallest intention of crossing back. He told her, there among the dead roses, the plain, undisguised shape of his intentions, for he was not a man made for games, nor for the slow management of another soul's feelings. He had thought of her, he said, for 11 years. He had learned 3 weeks since, by chance, of her present circumstances from the idle mouth of his steward. He had come, upon the learning of it, to set those circumstances right. And he meant, he said, to ask her for her hand, not out of pity. The word came out hard and fast and edged, as though he had anticipated it from her lips and despised it in advance. Not pity. But because he had spent 11 years measuring every woman in England, the great beauties, the great heiresses, the practised charmers of 3 London seasons, against the steady memory of one clever girl in a white gown who had crossed a crowded room to be kind, and had found every last one of them wanting, and that he was done. "I am not a comfortable man," he told her, and his voice was deliberately level, which somehow made it worse, or better. "I have been alone a very long time. I have all but forgotten how to be otherwise. And the things I feel, on the rare occasions I feel anything at all, I feel without moderation and without much mercy, least of all to myself. I am telling you this plainly, before anything is decided between us, so you understand exactly what you would be accepting should you ever consent to accept me. I would not be an easy husband. I can promise you almost nothing in the way of ease. But I can promise you this, and I can promise it before God, that I would never, so long as there was breath in my body, permit any living soul to put you upon a floor again." Tabitha looked up at this strange, severe, plainly broken man, there among the dead roses, and felt the first dangerous flicker of a thing she had believed scrubbed clean out of her forever. The thing called hope. And being a clever woman who noticed everything, she felt in the same instant the cold shadow hope casts, which is fear, because hope was the most dangerous of all the dangerous things, far more dangerous than any open cruelty, and because she had learned in this very house, at fearful cost, exactly what it came to let oneself want a thing. "Why should I believe you?" she said, and she made herself hold his grey gaze while she said it. "Men of your rank do not marry women of mine, not as I am now, not a drudge with ash beneath her nails. You could keep me, your grace, far more cheaply and quietly than you could marry me, and the world would think nothing of it and call you generous besides. So tell me plainly why I should believe you mean honourably by me, when everything that has happened to me within these walls for 2 years has taught me, past all forgetting, that no one ever does." The Duke was silent a long moment, the cold wind moving in the bare black branches above them. Then he reached inside his black coat and drew out something very small and held it out to her, open, upon his gloved palm. It was a length of pale ribbon, faded now, the colour very nearly gone, soft and worn thin and almost translucent with long handling, the kind a young girl might once have worn, threaded through her dark hair on a summer evening. "You dropped this," he said, and now for the first time the level voice was not quite level. "At the Bakewell Assembly, 11 years ago, as you went in to supper. I took it up from the floor, meaning only to return it to you. And then I was sent for, and I went, and I never—" He stopped. "I have carried it since, every day of 11 years. I am aware of how that must sound to you. I find I do not greatly care how it sounds. It is the truth, and you have asked me for the truth." And Tabitha looked down at the faded ribbon lying upon his open palm, at this absurd, impossible, utterly devastating proof of 11 years of silence, and understood, with a certainty that went past all argument into the very bones of her, that whatever else the Duke of Hawthorn might be, he was not a man who was lying to her. She did not say yes. Not that day in the garden. She was far too clever and too frightened and too sharply aware that to say yes there among the roses would be to place a loaded weapon directly in her stepmother's hand, before she herself understood the shape of the battlefield on which she now stood. But neither, you will mark, did she say no. And the Duke, who understood the deep uses of patience more truly than any man then living, bowed gravely over her gloved hand, and said only that he would call again, and turned and walked away down the gravel toward his waiting black carriage, and left her standing alone among the dead and thorny roses, holding 11 years of a silent man's devotion cupped in her own 2 ruined hands. Now the world, having seen a duke walk twice in a garden with a girl it had long agreed to despise, did the thing the world has always done. It began all at once to look at her. And this is where I must bring a new figure before you, for a true story is rarely so clean a thing as a single villain and a single rescue, and Tabitha's path was about to grow more tangled, not less. There lived in the neighbourhood a young gentleman named Mr. Piers Holloway, a nephew of the very knight to whose son Drusilla had been so nearly promised, a handsome, easy, golden-haired young man of good family and middling fortune and considerable charm, who had never in his idle life troubled to notice the existence of Tabitha Merrow in the years she was a grey drudge on her knees. But a girl with whom the Duke of Hawthorn walks twice in a garden is a girl transformed in the eyes of every ambitious young man in 3 parishes. For surely that which the great and terrible Duke has deemed worth wanting must itself be worth a lesser man's wanting. And Mr. Holloway, who was not wicked, but was idle and vain and fond of a contest, decided of a sudden, with great warmth, that he was quite extraordinarily taken with Miss Merrow, and that it would be a fine thing indeed to win the prize where a duke had only begun to woo. And Ursula Vane, scenting in this young Holloway a heaven-sent means to spoil the Duke's dangerous interest before it could ripen into her ruin, threw the 2 young people together at every turn. For if only Tabitha could be got safely, swiftly, respectably betrothed to a mere Mr. Holloway, the Duke's perilous attention would find it had nothing left to fix upon, and the girl, married and removed, could carry her dangerous, noticing, knowing eyes clean out of Hartcombe and out of Ursula's life forever. And so Tabitha, who wanted Mr. Piers Holloway not at all, found herself manoeuvred again and again into his bright, shallow company at a neighbour's dinner, to which she was now suddenly, grudgingly, pointedly permitted to go, in the drawing-room of an evening where Ursula contrived with heavy unsubtlety to leave the two of them alone, on the gravel walks where he talked a great deal and listened to her not at all. He was, she thought, watching him rather like bright sunlight upon shallow water, pleasant enough to look upon, and dazzling in his easy way, and entirely, fatally without depth. It was at the neighbours' dinner, the Faradays, a comfortable squire's family 2 miles distant across the fields, that the matter came to its head. Mr. Holloway, flushed with the squire's good wine and the heady novelty of his pursuit, had attached himself to Tabitha's side the whole evening, and as the company rose from the long table, he caught at her gloved hand to lead her through into the music-room, and held it a great deal too long and too warmly, and leaned close to murmur some practised gallantry against the curve of her ear. And Tabitha, who had not given him her hand, nor leave to take it, felt the old, cold, familiar helplessness rise within her, the dreadful sensation so deeply known in that house of being a thing handled and disposed of rather than a person consulted, and she could not, in the crowded watching-room, for the sake of her own precarious, newly mended standing, openly pull herself away. She did not have to, for the Duke of Hawthorne, who had been invited to the Faradays' table as a matter of neighbourly course, and who had accepted that invitation, as he never accepted any invitation, for one reason in all the world, was standing across the room. And he had seen. I want you to understand that the Duke did not cross that room quickly. He did not raise his voice, nor alter his expression, nor do one single thing the watching company might afterward have pointed to and called a scene. He simply somehow arrived, was, between one moment and the next, there at Tabitha's side, as though he had stood there always, his presence filling and freezing the small space of air between her and young Holloway, the way cold, dark water fills a tipped and sinking glass. "Holloway," he said pleasantly. The single word was perfectly pleasant. It was also, at the same time, the most quietly frightening sound Tabitha had ever heard a human creature make. "You have Miss Merrow's hand. I rather think she would like it returned to her." Mr. Holloway, who was vain but not, when it came to it, an utter fool, looked once into the Duke's grey and bottomless eyes, and went the dead grey colour of cold ash, and dropped Tabitha's hand as though it had turned to a live coal in his grasp. "Your Grace, I meant, no, that is, Miss Merrow and I are we are upon terms of—" "Miss Merrow," said the Duke, still perfectly terribly pleasant, still perfectly quiet, "is not available." He let the silence sit a moment, in which the entire music-room seemed to hold its breath. "To you, or to any other man in this room. I should be very sorry indeed, Holloway, if there were any further confusion upon the point." And he turned from the young man then, completely, as though Holloway had in that instant simply, quietly, forever ceased to exist, and offered Tabitha his own arm, and she took it, her heart going like a hammer against her ribs, and he led her away through the parting, staring, murmuring company as gravely as though he were leading a reigning duchess out of a royal ballroom, and not a stepmother's drudge out of a squire's music-room. On the cool, dark, deserted terrace beyond the long windows, away at last from the watching eyes, he stopped and dropped her arm. And she saw, in the faint light spilling from the windows, that beneath all the icy pleasantness he was, she could scarcely credit it, very faintly shaking, trembling just perceptibly with a fury so deep and banked and controlled that it had found no outlet in all the world but that one fine betraying tremor. "Forgive me," he said, low and rough, all the smooth pleasantness gone now that they were alone. "I had no right. You are not mine, that I should— I am perfectly aware you are not mine. But when I saw his hand laid upon you, and you unable to be free of it—" He stopped and mastered himself again with a visible, costly effort. "I find I have not the smallest gift for the sharing of what for sharing. It is one of the many things, Miss Merrow, that make me such poor husband material. I thought it only fair you should see it plainly and early rather than discover it late." And Tabitha, standing on the dark terrace with the cold spring stars wheeling overhead and her heart yet hammering, not, she realized with a shock of alarm, from any fear of Holloway, but from the sudden nearness of the man before her, found she was not, after all, afraid of his fury, in the way she had been afraid of her stepmother's cold for 2 years. There was a difference, she was beginning to learn, and it was the whole difference in the world, between a possessiveness that wished only to cage a living thing, and a possessiveness that could not bear to watch that thing be handled roughly against its will. The first had ruled and ruined her whole life. The second, she was beginning dimly to understand, was something else entirely, and went by a warmer name. "You needn't apologize to me," she said quietly into the dark. "I did not want his hand upon me. I have spent 2 years being handled by people who never once thought to ask my leave. You, at least, you looked first to see whether I wished to be rescued before you rescued me." She paused, and something within her, reckless and long-buried and suddenly waking, made her add, low, "I did wish it." For one long, suspended, breathless moment on the dark, starlit terrace, the Duke of Hawthorn went very still and looked down at her, and she saw his grey gaze drop, just once, to her mouth, and felt the whole cold, wide night narrow and close to the small, warm space of trembling air between them. He was close. He had not meant, she thought, to be so close. She could smell the sandalwood and cold, clean leather of him, and she found she had quite stopped breathing and did not in the least wish to step away. His hand came up slowly, as though it moved against his own settled will, and the backs of his gloved fingers brushed, once, very lightly, down the line of her cold cheek. And the touch went through her like a struck and ringing bell, singing down into the deepest parts of her she had thought gone silent forever. And he bent his dark head toward her, and she lifted her face up to his. And "Tabitha!" Ursula's voice, sharp and high and carrying, came stabbing across the dark terrace from the lit doorway. "Whatever in heaven's name are you doing, lurking out here in the cold? Come in, this instant. The carriage is called, and we are waiting upon you." And the fragile, shimmering moment shattered into 1,000 pieces, like dropped crystal on a stone floor. The Duke straightened. Tabitha stepped back, her face burning, her heart in ruins about her feet, and the two of them stood, a foot apart in the sudden, ordinary, killing cold, having very nearly and not at all crossed a line neither would ever afterward forget. "Until next time, Miss Merrow," the Duke said low, and there was a roughness in the saying of it that was its own confession. And Tabitha went into her waiting stepmother on legs that did not feel entirely her own, and lay awake the whole of that long night and did not sleep. But I have run ahead of the darker thread, and I must double back to it. For while the Duke was learning on that terrace that he could not bear to see Tabitha touched against her will, Tabitha herself had been quietly turning over, in the watchful back room of her mind, the small cold fragments she had gathered through 2 years upon the floor. The word settlement, and the brittle, nervous laugh, and the small locked drawer in the study desk. And they had begun at last to draw together into a shape. And the shape they made was the shape of a crime. Let me lay the whole of the law before you, plainly, for the entire reckoning to come turns upon it. In 1853, as I have told you, a married woman could own nothing in her own name, but an unmarried woman could. And Tabitha, at her father's death, had been left specific property of her own, a marriage settlement of £4,000, a very great sum, to come to her absolutely upon her marriage or upon her 25th birthday, whichever should the first arrive, held in trust until that day, and administered in the meantime by her appointed guardian, by her guardian. You see the whole shape of the trap now, I think, exactly as Tabitha had at last begun to see it, kneeling in the cold. Ursula Vane, as the appointed guardian, held the entire unwatched control of Tabitha's £4,000. And Tabitha, but 21, was years yet from the birthday that would have freed it, which gave the thief a long, quiet runway in the dark. And Ursula Vane had in 2 short years married off one daughter with a grand wedding and grand dowry, very nearly betrothed a second, run a great expensive house, and maintained throughout a handsome rising style of living, all upon an estate income that could not, by Tabitha's careful reckoning, have stretched to the half of what had been spent. The money for Bryony's dowry, for the wedding breakfast, for the silks, the wine, the fine new travelling carriage and kind, it had all come from somewhere. And Tabitha, scrubbing the flags, outside the study door, had heard the guilty, careful word, settlement. She had now a very good guess where it had come from. What she lacked was the proof. And the proof, she knew, lay in the ledger, in the small locked drawer in the study. It took her 9 long nights to come at it, and I will not pretend it was any clever feat of spycraft, for it was nothing of the kind. It was only patience, the deep, bottomless, perfected patience of a woman who possessed nothing left in the world but time and silence and her own hard-won invisibility. She watched and waited, night upon night, until she had learned for a certainty that her stepmother kept the small brass key always upon a ribbon at her waist through every hour of the day, but laid it carefully by each night in a little painted porcelain box on her dressing table. She waited until a night when the whole household was abed, and the moon was down and dark, and her stepmother, who had taken a good deal of wine at supper, slept heavily behind her closed chamber door. And then Tabitha Merrow rose from her cold garret bed and went up the freezing black servant's stair in her bare, silent feet, her heart slamming so hard she felt sure it must wake the house, every creaking board a thunderclap in the listening dark, and she slipped into the dark, wine-thick bedchamber where Ursula's slow breath rasped on, undisturbed, and she took the small cold key from the painted box with fingers that shook so badly she could scarcely make them close upon it, and she crept down again the whole long way to the study, and she fitted the key, and turned it, and opened the drawer, and read the ledger that lay within, by the meagre guttering light of a single stolen tallow stub, until the close-written figures swam and danced before her aching eyes. And there it was. There the whole of it was, set down neat and patient and damning in her stepmother's own careful copperplate, the trust fund drawn steadily down, quarter by quarter, year by year, £4,000 reduced, line by patient line, to something now well under 500, her inheritance, her dead father's last most loving provision for her, the £4,000 he had set aside that she might never in her life be at any man's mercy, spent, every shining pound of it, spent upon the weddings, the silks, the comforts, the rising fortunes of the very women who had put her upon the floor and bidden her stay there. Tabitha copied out the worst of the pages onto a single sheet of paper she had stolen from that same desk, her cramping hand flying, her tears falling silently and blotting the wet ink, so that she was forced to begin again, twice. Then she returned the ledger to its drawer, exactly as she had found it, and locked it, and carried the small cold key back up the long freezing stair, and laid it again in its painted box, not 3 feet from her stepmother's sleeping, unguarded face, and crept back down to her cold garret. and lay there in the frost-flowered dark with the folded proof of her own long ruin pressed against her heart, and felt, burning clean and bright and hot and terrible within her chest, a thing she had not felt in 2 years. It was not hope this time. It was anger, and anger, she discovered, lying there in the dark, was warm. She told the Duke at his very next call. She had thought long and hard in the careful days before upon whether to tell him at all, whether instead to keep the proof close for herself and use it herself, and be for once in her life the sole author of her own deliverance, and not forever the rescued object of another's. But she was, above all things, a clear-eyed realist, schooled hard and long in the brutal realities of power and of place. And she knew, with cold certainty, that a scullery drudge advancing an accusation of theft against a respectable gentlewoman would be laughed clean out of every drawing-room and every court in England, while a duke advancing that same accusation would be believed before he reached the end of his sentence. The proof was worthless, and worse than worthless in her own hand. In his hand it was a drawn sword. So she told him, in the garden, in a low, rapid voice, the whole of it, the settlement, the ledger, the swimming, damning figures, and she watched his hard face while she spoke. And she saw it change. She had braced herself for him to dismiss her, or soothe her, or take the whole matter, gently and condescendingly out of her hands, as a thing too weighty for a mere woman's managing. He did none of those things. He listened to the very end, without once interrupting, and then he was silent a long moment, and when at last he spoke, his voice had gone very quiet and very flat and very level. And it was, I do think, the single most frightening sound Tabitha had ever heard a human being make. "She drew down your settlement," he said, "your father's provision for you, the £4,000 he set aside out of his love, that you might never lie at any man's mercy." A pause, and something moved far back behind the cold grey of his eyes, like a great slow fish turning in deep, freezing water. "And spent it to marry off her own 2 daughters, and set you the while to scrub the floors of your own father's house upon your knees." "Yes," Tabitha said. "Then she has made," said the Duke of Hawthorn with a terrible, gentle, bottomless quiet, "a mistake she shall have the whole long remainder of her life to regret." And he looked at Tabitha with the grey eyes that frightened the whole of Derbyshire, and no longer frightened her at all, and said, "Will you trust me to ruin her, properly and completely, by the law and before the assembled world, so that it can never in this life be undone, and so that you are never again, so long as you live, left at the mercy of anyone?" And Tabitha Merrow, who had knelt on cold stone in the dark for 2 years while the woman who robbed her drank down her dead father's wine and married off her daughters upon her stolen gold, looked at the man who had carried her faded ribbon in silence next to his heart for 11 years and said, "Yes, with the whole of my heart, yes. Now, I told you at the beginning, this is a story of revenge quite as much as a story of love, and here is the place where the 2 bright threads twist and braid themselves together and become impossible to part. But the path did not run smooth from this point to the reckoning, and you must not expect that it should, for the surest way to know a story is an honest one is that the night grows darkest just in the last hour before the dawn. The Duke did not strike at once. That is the whole difference between a man caught up in a hot rage and a cold man like Hawthorn. The rage spends and exhausts itself in an afternoon, and leaves nothing changed, but the patient gathering arrives all at once, at the chosen hour, like a flood let loose through a broken dam. Over the following fortnight, all the while continuing to call at Hartcombe with a perfect, untroubled, chilling courtesy that made Ursula's skin crawl, the Duke quietly set the great slow, grinding machinery of the law in motion. He engaged the finest and most discreet solicitor to be had in Derby. He had Tabitha's copied pages examined and verified, and he turned his attention with a quiet and a terrible patience to the steward Pollard. that soft-handed, uneasy man who had carried the widow's secrets on every quarter-day, and who had begun, of late, to sleep very badly. But Ursula Vane, I have told you, was never a stupid woman, and there is no creature on earth more dangerous than a cornered one, in the very moment it understands the trap has truly closed. She saw the Duke's courteous, frequent calls now for exactly what they were. She saw her steward Pollard growing daily greyer, more silent, more given to casting anxious glances toward the door. She understood, with cold, rising, choking desperation, that the whole fabric of her stolen, comfortable life now hung suspended by a single fraying thread, and that the thread was Tabitha. Tabitha, who saw everything. Tabitha, who must somehow have seen. And Ursula Vane resolved in the cold, secret privacy of her wicked, frightened heart that the girl must be got out of the Duke's reach, and the law's reach, and out of the way, entirely, before she could open her mouth and speak. She was far past careful calculation now. The patient thief who had drained a trust by inches had been driven clean out of her, and in her place sat only the cornered animal, which does not reckon the odds, but only claws toward the nearest darkness. Alive and knowing Tabitha, in that desperate hour, looked to Ursula's panicked eye like the certain gallows, and any risk at all, however wild and ruinous, looked the better bargain beside it. And so we come now, you and I, to the very darkest hour of this story, and I will tell you plainly in advance, for I know some of you who listen are tender of heart, and I do not like to take you unawares, that there is real danger in what is coming, and that for a little while together it is going to seem all is surely lost. Keep listening. I give you my word, the dawn is coming. It was a black, streaming night in the last week of March, the kind of wild Derbyshire night when the swollen rivers come roaring up brown and white over their banks, and the deep lanes turn all to running, sucking mud, when Ursula sent for Tabitha, and told her in a voice all false, sudden, oily gentleness that should itself have served for warning, that her stepmother's married sister away at Ashbourne had been taken gravely ill, and that Tabitha must go to her at once, that very night, through the storm, to help in the nursing, that the gig was even now being put to, and the stable boy would drive her the full dozen miles through the dark and the rain. And Tabitha, who by now trusted nothing her stepmother said, and this least of all, protested the lateness of the hour and the wildness of the weather. And Ursula's careful mask slipped, just for an instant, far enough to show the cold, desperate thing beneath, and she said only, very low, "You will go, or you will go from this house tonight with nothing, and to nowhere. Choose." And so Tabitha, helpless, friendless, trapped, climbed up into the open gig in the driving, freezing rain, with the frightened young stable boy hunched at the reins beside her, and they went out together into the black, roaring night. They never reached Ashbourne. There was no sick sister at Ashbourne. There never had been. What there was, instead, 3 flooded miles down the drowned running lane, was the old ford across the Henmore brook, and the brook that night was up and raging, a brown, bellowing torrent of black water where in the dry of summer there ran only a clear, shallow trickle over the stones. And the stable boy, who had been told by his mistress, low and hard, only that he must get the young lady across, whatever befell, and on no account turn back, drove the terrified, plunging horse down into the black, roaring water against every true instinct he possessed. The current took them at once, bodily, the whole rig of them. The gig lurched and slewed and tipped, and the horse screamed and reared and plunged in its traces, and the cold brown water came up, and over the wheels, and over the floor of the gig, and dragged at Tabitha's heavy skirts with 100 freezing, pulling, drowning hands, and the boy was flung clear and went scrambling and choking for the bank. and Tabitha, tangled fast in the wreck of her own sodden skirts and the splintering wreck of the overturning gig, went down and under into the roaring, freezing dark. And here, my friends, is the one thing Ursula Vane, in all her cold, desperate calculation, had wholly failed to reckon upon. For the Duke of Hawthorne, who trusted Ursula Vane not 1 inch, and who had, ever since the matter of young Holloway, quietly kept a watchful man of his own posted to mark the comings and goings at the gates of Hartcombe, had word brought to him within the half-hour that a gig had gone out from the house into the very teeth of the storm at an hour when no honest errand was ever run, with Miss Merrow seated up in it. And he was up and out of his chair, and onto his fastest horse, and gone galloping into the streaming, roaring night before the breathless man had finished his message. He knew these lanes. He knew this ford. And he came down upon the bellowing black water of the swollen Henmore at the full, reckless gallop, and saw in one blue shuddering flash of lightning the broken wreck of the gig upon its side, and the dark dragging sinking shape of a woman's skirts in the black racing current. And he was out of the saddle and down into the freezing killing torrent. Before thought, before fear, before anything. Plunging in, waist deep, then chest deep against the whole brown, bellowing weight of the flood, his searching hand sweeping the black water before him until they closed at last, oh, at the very last, upon the sodden, slipping cloth of a sleeve, and a cold arm within it, and he hauled her up and back and to him against the whole drowning strength of the river, up and out and onto the muddy, streaming bank, and fell there with her in the rain and the mud, her dark hair plastered cold across a face gone grey and slack and terribly still. She was not breathing. For one moment, one endless, frozen, bottomless moment the Duke of Hawthorne was to carry within him to the last day of his life. She was not breathing at all, and her cold, dead weight lay there in his arms in the streaming rain like the death of the entire world. And he heard a sound come tearing up and out of his own chest that he did not recognize, a raw, broken animal thing he had never in his life made before. And then he turned her hard, face down across his knee, and struck her between the thin shoulder blades, once and twice, and the brown river water came up and out of her in a choking, gushing rush. And she gasped, and she coughed, and she was racked and bent double with the coughing of it, and she lived. And the Duke gathered her up, all of her, against him, there in the mud and the streaming, roaring dark, and held her so hard it hurt them both, and pressed his face down into her cold, wet hair, and said her name over and over and over again, like a man saying a prayer he had long since given over all hope of having answered. Tabitha, Tabitha, I have you. I have you now. You are not to leave me. Do you hear me? You are not ever permitted to leave me. And Tabitha, half drowned, shuddering, barely conscious, with the cold of the river still in her heaving lungs, heard the breaking, the splitting clean apart in the voice of the coldest man in all of England, and turned her cold, streaming face blindly in against his soaked chest and clung to him. He carried her home to Aldermere himself that very night, wrapped in his own greatcoat, held before him on his own horse through the whole long streaming dark, and he would suffer no one else to tend her, and he sent out in the night for a physician and for his own great-aunt besides. And here, at last, I must bring before you the final figure of our company, for she matters very greatly to all that is yet to come. The Dowager Countess of Foxley was the Duke's own great-aunt on his late mother's side, a small, upright, fearsomely sharp-eyed old woman of some 70 years, with a tongue like a fresh stropped paring knife and a heart beneath it all of the purest gold. She had buried 2 husbands in her long life and feared nothing on the earth or under it, and she had despaired these 10 years and more of her great-nephew's long, cold, solitary freezing of himself. She came to him at his summons, through the worst of the storm, without a single question asked. And she took one long look at the half-drowned, shivering girl laid in the great bed, and another at the grey-faced, wild-eyed Duke, who would not be moved from the door of the room. And she understood the whole of it, entire, in a single instant, in the way clever old women understand everything that matters. And from that night onward, the Dowager Countess of Foxley was Tabitha's fiercest and most unshakable friend and champion in all the world. And that, I promise you, mattered more than I can tell you. For the friendship of such a woman was a kind of armour no Ursula Vane who ever drew breath could hope to pierce. Tabitha lay 3 days and 3 nights in a high fever, the cold of the river having got down deep into her chest, and on the worst of those nights it was a very near thing. And the Duke did not sleep at all, but sat the long black hours through upon a hard chair in the passage without her door, while his great aunt sat the watch within by the bed. And when at last, upon the grey dawn of the 4th day, the fever broke, and Tabitha opened her eyes, clear and weak and knowing, and understood where she lay, the first thing she saw was the small, fierce shape of the Dowager Countess, dozing bolt upright and disapproving even in her sleep in a chair beside the bed. And the second thing she saw, through the half-opened door, was the Duke of Hawthorne himself, fallen asleep at the very last in his hard chair out in the cold passage, his dark head dropped back against the panelled wall, his hard, guarded face gone, in the helplessness of sleep, young and open and deeply marked with exhaustion, the face of a man who had sat without her door for 3 days and nights because he could not bear to be 1 inch further from her than that. And something within Tabitha, some last frozen, locked thing even the recognition upon the steps had not quite reached and thawed, broke, quietly and warmly and completely apart. And here, my friends, here, at the very moment you might most reasonably expect the story to turn at last toward its happiness, here is the place where it very nearly all comes undone. For when Tabitha was at last strong enough to sit up against her pillows and to speak, the Duke came in to her, and his face was hard again, and closed again, and barred again from within. And he told her plainly what he had resolved. He would have her safe. He could not, he said, and his level voice was rough and frayed with the still living memory of her cold, dead weight in his arms on the river bank. He could not live through such a night again. The thought of it stopped the breath in his throat. And so he had arranged it all. She would not return to Hartcombe, not for a single hour. She would go at once instead to the Dowager Countess's own house, away at Foxley, a full 20 miles distant, where she would be safe and respectable and beyond Ursula Vane's reach, while he completed the long, slow business of the law. And when it was all finished, and Ursula ruined, and the danger past, why then he would come for her, and they would be married, and she would never want for safety again. It was all arranged. It was all, he said, for the best, for her own good. And Tabitha, sitting up against the white pillows, pale and weak, and 3 short days from her own grave, heard those words, heard the words "for your own good" fall, gently, lovingly, from the very mouth of the man she was learning, against all her long-schooled caution, to love, and felt the cold close over her heart as surely, as suddenly, as completely as ever the brown river had closed over her head. For your own good was the exact, the precise language of her whole captivity. For your own good was the very phrase Ursula Vane had used, smiling when she dismissed the lady's maid. It is for your own good, my dear, that you learn to make yourself useful. It was the language of every single person who had ever, in the whole of Tabitha's life, decided between themselves what was to become of her, without once troubling to ask her what she herself might wish. And it did not matter. It did not, in that one cold, flinching instant, matter at all that the Duke meant it with the whole of his loving, frightened heart, and meant it in pure kindness. The words themselves had been spoiled forever, and they spoiled now in her hearing even his love along with them. "You have arranged everything," she said, very low. "I have made you safe," he said. "Not yet, not at all, understanding. It is all settled. You need do nothing in the world but go." "You have arranged everything," she said again. And now he heard it, the thing in her voice, and went very still. "Where I am to go, when I am to be married, what is to become of me and of the whole of the rest of my life, you have settled the entire course of it between yourself and your great-aunt and your solicitor in Derby, and you have come in here to tell me of it, the way a man tells a parcel where it is to be sent." She was shaking now with weakness and with a grief that astonished her by its depth. "Do you know, can you possibly know, that those are the very words she used, for your own good, every single time she took another thing from me? My maid, my room, my name, my place at my own father's table, all of it, every theft, for my own good. I have been managed for my own good for 2 whole years by people who loved me not at all, and I find I cannot, that I will not, go straight out of her keeping and into yours, however gentle yours might prove. A kind cage, your grace, is still a cage. I would sooner have drowned in the Henmore brook than be put away safe at Foxley, like a thing too precious and too foolish and too breakable to be so much as consulted in its own fate." Her voice broke clean across. "I thought you saw me. Upon the steps I thought, you, of all the souls in the world, you saw me. And now you would dispose of me, neatly and safely, exactly like all the rest." The Duke had gone white to the lips. "Tabitha, I only meant—" "I know exactly what you meant," she said, and the tears were running freely now, unstoppably, down her thin face. "And that is the very thing that makes it unbearable. Please, please, go. I am very tired." And the Duke of Hawthorne, who could face down the whole of Parliament without the flicker of an eyelid, who had walked chest deep into a flooded, killing river, without one thought spared for his own life, who had not, in 11 long years, been once at a loss before any living creature, stood in the doorway of that quiet room, with his whole hard face come undone, and found he had no answer in him at all. And he bowed stiffly and went, and the door closed quietly between them. Now I must tell you of the weeks that followed, and I must tell you of them both, the man and the woman, for a separation is only ever worth the telling if both who are parted bleed, and bleed truly, from the wound. And these two bled. Tabitha went, in the end, to Foxley, but not because the Duke had commanded it. She went because the Dowager Countess of Foxley, who was wiser than her own great-nephew by the hard lessons of 40 years, came and sat herself down by Tabitha's bed and said to her, dry and gentle and direct, "Child, go to Foxley because I am asking it of you, and because it will gall that proud, foolish man past all bearing, to be made to leave you safe in my keeping where he cannot reach you and cannot manage you and cannot arrange you. And because a woman, my dear, fights a great deal better from dry ground than ever she does from the bottom of a river. Come and be safe upon your own terms, and let him learn at his age the unfamiliar art of asking." And Tabitha, who could refuse the Duke, but found she could not refuse this small, sharp, clear-eyed old woman who had named in a single breath the very thing she most needed, went. And at Foxley she healed, and she grew strong again, and she grew, for the first time in 2 long years, free. She had her own room, with a good fire kept burning in the grate. She slept each night until she woke of her own accord. She walked out where she liked, and when she liked, and with whom she liked. She was, by the cold letter of the law that had so long imprisoned her, still her stepmother's ward. But at Foxley, under the fierce, sheltering wing of the Dowager Countess, she was, for the first time in 2 years, a person, consulted and heeded and asked and answered. And she discovered, to her own great confusion and dismay, that the more free she grew, the more her foolish heart ached and yearned and reached after the very man she had sent away. And not because she had any longer the smallest need of him, for she was learning at Foxley the steadying lesson that she needed no one living to stand between herself and the world, but because she missed him, which is a wholly different and far more dangerous and far more honest thing. She missed his rare, sudden, transforming smile. She missed the way he shortened his long stride without thought to match her own. She missed, above all things, being seen. And she began slowly lying awake in her warm, free room to understand a thing, that she had been so very afraid of the kind cage that she had perhaps mistaken a clumsy, frightened, ungainly, and altogether real love for the cold bars of one. As for the Duke, he was, by every account, that found its way to Foxley through the Dowager's brisk, regular correspondence, in a very bad way indeed. He did not write to Tabitha. He had understood, at least, that much. That to press her now to plead would be only to prove her every fear of him true, and so he held himself back, and apart and silent with an effort that was plainly, visibly costing him a very great deal. But he flung the whole of himself instead into the business of her stepmother's ruin, into the law and the gathering of evidence and the slow, cold, total destruction of Ursula Vane, with a ferocity that frightened even his own hardened solicitor, for it was the one thing left in all the world he could yet do for her, the one road left by which he might yet love her, that she had not, in her hurt, expressly forbidden him to walk. He did not sleep. He did not eat as a man should. The Dowager Countess, returning once from a visit to Aldermere, told Tabitha bluntly, over the tea, that her great-nephew looked to have aged 10 years in as many weeks, and had the look of a man steadily eating himself alive from within. And that he had said to her, in a single rare, unguarded moment, that he would finish the thing through to its end and see Ursula Vane brought down, whether or not Tabitha ever found it in her heart to forgive him, because the girl's safety mattered to him a great deal more than ever her forgiveness did. And that this, the sharp old woman had observed, setting down her cup, was either the most arrant foolishness or the truest love she had heard fall from the mouth of any man in 50 years, and that she had not yet entirely made up her own mind which. Both, Tabitha thought, lying awake that night, the old woman's words turning over and over within her. It was both. It had always, with him, been both. I'll pause here just a moment, my friends, because this is one of my own most favourite turns in the whole of this story, and I will confess I wrote it and rewrote it more times than I am willing now to admit. There is a particular grief in being parted from someone not by hatred and not by any failing of love, but by a wound given in love, by a kindness that landed through no fault of the giving as the cold door of a cage. And there is a particular, quiet, unsung courage in what each of these two did, alone in those long weeks apart. He, in loving her in the one way she had left open to him, without demand, without plea, without hope of reward, and she in learning, day by patient day, to be free enough and whole enough that if she chose him in the end, if she chose him, it would be the free considered choice of a whole woman, and not the drowning, clutching grasp of a frightened one. They were, the both of them, in those weeks of their parting, becoming at last the kind of people who could be married to one another. They were only doing it 20 cold miles apart, and in the dark, and in pain. Keep listening, because the reckoning, when at last it came all at once. For the slow machinery of the law, The whole of this while had been grinding steadily on toward its appointed hour, and the Duke chose his moment, as such a man always and infallibly will, with a terrible and fitting eye. He chose Drusilla's betrothal dinner, for Ursula, you see, desperate now, watching her whole world contract and close in about her week by week, and not yet knowing for a certainty that Tabitha had even survived the river, far less to what purpose, nor how much the Duke now held gathered in his hand, had resolved to salvage what poor little she yet could by rushing forward the one prize that remained within her grasp. She would see Drusilla safely, grandly, finally married, before the whole tottering edifice of her fortunes could come down about her ears. She set the betrothal dinner for the 2nd week of April, and spared upon it no expense whatsoever. Spared, that is, no expense of Tabitha's stolen money, of which a very little yet remained, and invited to it every family of any consequence in the district, the knight and his lady and their son, the Squire Faraday and his comfortable people, the whole of the local gentry in their best, and even Bryony and her gouty baron, summoned down from the next county to lend the grand affair the borrowed weight of a title. She did not invite the Duke of Hawthorne. She had judged, and for once judged entirely rightly, that his strange, dark, unaccountable interest in her stepdaughter had become a thing best kept very far indeed from her guests and from her plans. So, when his black, unmarked carriage came up the Hartcombe Drive, at the very height of that grand dinner, and his name was announced, cold and clear and ringing, into the crowded, candle-lit, chattering dining-room, Ursula Vane's painted face went the grey-white colour of cold tallow. The Duke entered, in his severe evening black, and behind him came a second man, grave, dark-suited, carrying a slim leather case, the solicitor come down from Derby. And behind the two of them, upon the Duke's own arm, in a gown of the deepest midnight blue silk the Duke had caused to be made for her in secret, and had sent ahead to Foxley but that very week, her dark hair dressed high and gleaming, her healed hands hidden in long white gloves, her chin held level, and her dark eyes very bright and very calm and very steady, walked Tabitha Merrow. For Tabitha had made her choice. She had received the gown there at Foxley, and folded within it she had found a single line in the Duke's own hard hand, not a command this time, nor an arrangement, but a question, the first true question he had ever in his life asked of her. Will you come and see her answer for it? Not because I wish it of you, but because the seeing of it is yours, and yours alone, and because it is yours to choose whether or not you will see it. I will come for you only, and if you send me word. H. And Tabitha had read it, there in her warm free room, and had understood, in the reading, that he had learned, at the last, and at so dear a price, the lesson she had taught him on her sick-bed, that he had crossed 20 long miles and several cold weeks, and the whole hard distance of his own frozen nature, to learn at last, and for her, the unfamiliar art of asking. And she had sent him word, and so she came now into that bright, crowded room, not as a thing rescued, and not as a parcel delivered, but as a free woman, walking in of her own clear will upon the arm of the man she had freely, with her whole eyes open, chosen, come to watch justice done with her own steady eyes. The whole room fell into an utter, absolute, ringing silence. Half the county had heard by now that the Merrow girl had been made a drudge and a scandal and a thing to be pitied. Not one single soul among them had thought to see her enter the Hartcombe dining-room, dressed like the very duchess she was now so plainly about to become, and upon the arm of the most powerful man in all the north of England. Bryony's wine-glass stopped quite still, halfway upon its journey to her parted lips. Drusilla made a small, ugly, broken little sound. Mr. Holloway, seated near the foot of the long table, went pale, and found something of sudden, absorbing interest to study upon the cloth before him. And Ursula Vane rose up from the head of her table, the very seat of her triumph, and made her last desperate drowning cast for control. "Your Grace, this is a private family occasion, and the girl is not fit to—" "Sit down," said the Duke. He did not raise his voice. He had no need. There was a thing in the two short, quiet words, in the absolute, unhurried, bottomless authority behind them, that pressed Ursula Vane back down into her chair as surely, as inarguably, as a broad, flat hand laid upon her shoulder. And then, in the ringing, breathless silence of that crowded, candle-lit room, before the assembled gentry of 3 full parishes, the Duke of Hawthorne destroyed her. And he did it, my friends, not with rage, and not with shouting, but with paper, which is colder and very much more final than any rage that was ever kindled in the heart of man. He did it with documents, read out one by one into the appalled, breathless hush by the dry, clear, unhurried voice of the solicitor from Derby. First, the terms of the late Mr. Gerald Merrow's marriage settlement, the £4,000 set in trust for his daughter Tabitha, and the name of the trustee charged, before God and before the law, with its faithful keeping, Mrs. Ursula Vane. Then the ledger itself, for the Duke had obtained it the week before. Pollard, the steward, once he had been brought to choose which side of the dock he preferred to stand on, had quietly surrendered the book into the solicitor's keeping. And there was now no denying it, and no explaining it away, for it was written through and through in Ursula's own neat, careful hand. And the long, slow record of the disbursements was read out, quarter by quarter, year by year, £4,000, drawn steadily, patiently, line by line, down to almost nothing at all, and beside each separate theft, read out in that same dry, pitiless, unhurried voice, the date of it, set deliberately against the date of Bryony's grand wedding, against the date of Drusilla's costly trousseau, against the very date of the wine that stood that moment in the glasses upon the table, so that not one creature in all that room could any longer fail to understand that the very dinner they had come to eat, the very betrothal they had gathered to bless, had been bought and paid for, entire, with a robbed girl's stolen inheritance. Then the sworn, signed, witnessed statement of that same steward, Mr. Pollard, who, when a duke had laid before him the plain, cold choice of testifying truthfully to what he had seen, or else standing in the dock beside his mistress as her accomplice, had wept and had testified. And last of all, last, when the room was already gone as still and silent as the grave, when Drusilla had begun, quietly, helplessly to weep, and the night sun had already tellingly drawn back his own chair by a pointed inch from the table, the Duke himself spoke for the first time, and quietly. "Mrs. Vane," he said, "was appointed by a dying man to be the protector of his daughter. She used that sacred trust to rob the child, and to set her upon her knees, to scrub the very floors of her own dead father's house, that her own 2 daughters might be married off the more grandly upon the stolen money. The whole of the proof lies now before you. My solicitor has this afternoon filed his bill against her in Chancery. The law will grind slow, as the law always does. But the law was never the whole of what I came here to do. Society, madam, does not sit in Chancery. Society renders its verdict in a single night." He let the words settle over the silver and the guttering candlelight like a soft fall of grey ash. "She will answer to the court in its own long season. But tonight she answers to you, all of you. Every one of you who looked upon a gentleman's own daughter, brought down to her knees these 2 long years, and ate her stepmother's good dinners, and said nothing. You could hear the fire crackle and settle in the grate. You could hear Drusilla weeping. Not, you must understand, for Tabitha, never once, in all of it, for Tabitha, but for the grand marriage even then dissolving and crumbling and blowing away to nothing before her eyes. The night sun's mother, already risen from her place, her face shut cold and final as a slammed door, drawing her family up and out and away from a house that reeked now, suddenly, of scandal and theft and the courts, for no respectable family in all of England weds its son to that. You could hear Bryony's gouty baron say, low and furious and carrying in the dreadful silence, that he had not been told, that he would on no account be associated with this, that the carriage was to be called at once, and you could see Ursula Vane herself, who had ruled that whole house for 2 years upon nothing in the world but fear and stolen gold, understand, all at once, and entire, and forever, that it was finished, that the fear had crossed clean over now to the far side of her own table, and would never come back, that the grey drudge she had put upon the floor was standing now in midnight blue silk upon the arm of a duke, watching her with steady, dark, dry, tearless eyes, and that there would be no undoing of it. Not in this life, not ever. Now, I want to be honest with you here about the law, as I always try to be. For a story is only worth your trust if it will tell you the truth even about its own machinery. The law of 1853 had not yet made a felony of a faithless trustee. That would come only with the statutes of the years that followed. A woman robbed by her own guardian in that day looked for her remedy not to the criminal dock, but to the court of chancery, to equity, and to the slow grinding mills of the great court of conscience. And it was there that the Duke's solicitor struck. A bill was filed in chancery, and Ursula Vane was removed in disgrace from her trust, and ordered to make full restitution of every stolen pound, a restitution she could not begin to pay, so that her every last possession in the world was seized and sold to answer for it. But the deeper ruin was never the court's doing at all. It was that night, before the assembled county, that truly finished her. For there is no statute on the books of England half so merciless as a society that has decided all at once to look away. Within the 12-month she was stripped of every last claim upon Hartcombe and upon the Merrow money, and cast down into a poverty far colder, deeper and more friendless than any she had ever in her cruelty inflicted upon another, shunned utterly to the end of her days by the very society whose good opinion had been the whole of her religion. Bryony's mortified baron carried his wife off at once to a distant northern estate, and was never afterward reconciled to a single member of her disgraced, ruined family. And Bryony, who had so dearly loved to stand in the scullery doorway and watch her sister scrub, lived out the whole long remainder of her days in a cold marriage in a cold, far-off county, tied for life to a gouty, bitter man who never once forgave her the shame of that single dinner. Drusilla's betrothal was broken off within the week, and she did not, in the end, marry at all well. The 3 women who had built the whole of their comfort and their rising, and their pride upon the patient ruin of Tabitha Merrow, watched that comfort come apart again, stone by stone, in very nearly the same order, and by the same slow degrees, in which they had once taken hers apart. And Tabitha, I will tell you plainly, and without one word of apology for it, did not weep for any one of the 3 of them. Justice is not always a gentle thing. It is not required to be. And there was one reckoning more, a private one, that was never spoken of in any court. For the Duke had not forgotten the rigged Ford, nor the black water, nor the stable boy who had been ordered to drive a gentlewoman down into a flood and not turn back. He had the boy's sworn account of it, taken and witnessed and locked away in his keeping. And before Ursula Vane went down at last into her ruin, he saw to it, quietly, and alone with her, that she understood precisely what it was that he held. She had robbed a child, and for that she was disgraced and beggared and cast out. But she had also tried to drown one. And that was a thing that ended not in poverty, but at the end of a rope. She escaped the rope by one mercy alone, that Tabitha had lived, and would not be dragged through the horror of it all again to stand in a court and watch her hang. Ursula Vane went into her cold exile, knowing exactly how light her true punishment had been. And that knowledge, the Duke judged, would sit colder upon her through the long grey years than ever any prison cell could. He was not, I think, entirely wrong, but revenge, however richly and deeply it may satisfy, was never the true and beating heart of this story, and I have saved the heart of it for you for the very last. For Hartcombe, freed at last of its thief, came back entire and whole to Tabitha. The estate, the house, the £2,000 a year, the whole of it restored to its one rightful owner, who was at last, by her dead father's true and loving intention, a woman possessed of her own property and her own fortune and her own free, untrammelled will. And the Duke, who had ruined Ursula Vane with so cold and total and patient an efficiency, came to call upon the new mistress of Hartcombe some days after, and he found her there not grateful and soft and pliant, as a rescued woman is so often expected to be, but standing, composed in her own restored drawing-room, the mistress of her own house, at the last. "You have given me back my house," she said to him, "and my name, and my fortune, and my freedom, and I am more grateful for it than I have words within me to tell. But I sent you away once, in that room, at Aldermere, and I owe you the truth of why I did it, now that I am well and free, and able to say it to you as a free woman, and not as a drowning one." She drew a breath. "I have spent 2 years owned by a person who told me with every theft that it was for my own good. And when you stood in that doorway and arranged for me the whole future course of my life, for my own good, however gently, however much you meant it all in love, I could not bear it. I would have died first. Do you understand me? It was never that you wished to keep me safe. It was that you did not think first to ask me." "I know it," the Duke said low. "I have known it every hour of every day since. It is why I sent the gown with a question folded inside it and not with a command, and why I waited there at Aldermere, like a man waiting upon his own sentence to be read, and why I did not come, though it near killed me not to come, until you had sent me word. I have been a very great many years, Tabitha, learning how to feel anything at all. I'm only now, and late, beginning to learn how to feel it without at once trying to manage it, and arrange it, and make it safe. I shall be slow at the learning. I shall get it wrong, and wrong again. But I would 1,000 times rather get it wrong all the rest of my life beside you, than ever get it right, and alone. And here is how I knew, past all my doubting, that the Duke of Hawthorne loved her truly, past the obsession, and past the 11 years, and past the carried ribbon, and on into something far rarer and better and braver than any of those. For Tabitha looked at him and said, "Then you must do a thing no living soul has ever once done for me in the whole of my life. You must court me, properly and slowly, and as I am now, a woman with her own house and her own fortune, who is able to say no to you and to mean it, and to make it hold. I will not go straight out of a stepmother's keeping and into a husband's, not even into yours, that if I come to you in the end, it shall be because I crossed the whole long distance to you freely, and chose you freely at the end of the crossing. And I need you to want it so. I need you to want a wife who chose you, and not a ward you once saved out of a river. And the most feared man in all the north of England, who had never once in his life been refused anything he had set his hand to, who might have had any heiress in all of England merely for the asking, looked at the woman who had just told a duke to his face that he must earn her, and the hard grey eyes did not flash, nor frost with any anger. They warmed, and the rare, sudden, wholly transforming smile broke slowly across the hard face like the first sun coming up over a long, cold hill. "Then I will court you," he said, "for as long a time as it shall take. I have waited 11 years already, Tabitha Merrow. I find I am in no hurry at all." And court her he did, through the whole of that green lengthening spring, and on into the deep gold of the summer that followed, calling at Hartcombe, where she was now and forever the mistress, walking with her, slow, in the garden, where the roses had come back, full and blowing and glorious upon their thorns, talking with her by the hour of books and the management of land, and the strange, slow business of a frozen man learning, late, how to feel again, and how to thaw. She saw him laugh, more than once now, a real unguarded younger laugh. She saw him grieve openly when at last he told her the whole of it, the elder brother he had loved and lost, the great title that had come down and crushed the young man he had been, the long, cold, deliberate years afterward in which he had let his own heart freeze solid in his chest, because feeling, every time, had only ever cost him the people he loved. And somewhere within those long, bright, unhurried months, the hope that had so terrified Tabitha ceased, at last, and quietly, to terrify her at all, because she came to understand, finally, and in her very bones, that she had not, after all, been rescued into another and gentler and better appointed cage, but courted, patiently and with infinite care, out into the wide open air, by a man whose whole and entire desire it was that she should be free enough, and whole enough and strong enough to choose him of her own will. There came an evening, in the high gold of that summer, in the great library at Aldermere, for she went often, now, and freely, to Aldermere, the small, fierce dowager countess, always somewhere near at hand about the place, as her approving and unsleeping chaperone, when the two of them stood together at one of the tall windows in the last long amber light of a dying day, and he was showing her some old, curious, beautiful book, and their two heads bent close together over the open page, and she felt the warmth of him all down her side, and she looked up, and found him already looking down at her, the late gold light caught and held in the cold grey of his eyes, and turning it slowly, warm, and the air went still, and close, and humming, between the two of them, exactly as it had once gone still upon the Faraday's dark terrace, and this time there was no Ursula in any doorway, and no carriage called and waiting, and nothing in all the wide turning world to interrupt them. He set the old book down, very slowly, and he lifted his hand, and laid it against her cheek. Not the backs of his gloved fingers now, as upon the terrace, but his own bare, warm palm, his thumb tracing once slowly along the line of her jaw. And she did not step back, and found she did not, in the least, wish to. And she lifted her face up to his, and he bent his dark head down to hers. And at last, at long last, after the steps and the garden and the ribbon and the river and the weeks of cold, aching silence, he kissed her. And it was not at all, she found, like standing too near to a great fire, as she had once, frightened, imagined it might be. It was like coming in at the very end of a long, freezing, friendless journey, out of the dark, and into a warmth she had long ago given over all hope of finding in this world. And she put her two hands up against his chest, not this time to push him from her, but to hold him there fast. And she kissed him back, and felt 2 years of cold, and 11 years of a man's patient silence dissolve together, and melt, and run away to nothing, into the gold, and the quiet, and the warmth. She found the room a little while after, by purest accident, upon a later visit, when she had lost her way among Aldermere's many great shadowed corridors, and had opened a door she had taken for the door to another library, and stopped dead upon the very threshold, and could not move, and could not, for a moment, so much as breathe. It was a small room, and a sparely, plainly furnished one, and every single surface within it had been given over, with a terrible patient devotion, to her. There was a portrait of a dark-haired girl in a white gown, painted, she understood at once, with a lurch of the heart from memory, the face not quite right, the dark eyes set a little wrong, but unmistakably, achingly, unbearably meant for her own face, at 16. There was a single white rose pressed flat and dry as old paper beneath a small pane of glass. There was a yellowed dance card from a Bakewell assembly 11 long years gone, her own girlish hand recording across the face of it the names of partners she had forgotten the whole of a decade since. And there was a small wooden drawer set into the front of a writing desk, and when, with hands that had begun to shake, she drew it open, the breath went clean and entirely out of her body. For within it, folded and tied up carefully into bundles, and labelled each separate one of them in the Duke's own hard, careful hand, with dates that spanned the whole 11 years, were letters. Dozens upon dozens upon dozens of letters, letters he had written out to her, year upon year, all through the long, cold, frozen decade in which she had been to him a stranger he could not approach, and dared not, and could not, and would not ever forget. The very earliest of them, the ink upon it, a little faded now with the years, written in a younger, less guarded, more hopeful hand, began, "Miss Merrow, you will never read this, and so it is, I find, that I may at the last say to you, she did not read them all. She did not need to read them all. She stood there in the small, still, quiet room that was a shrine raised up to 11 years of a silent, patient, wholly unspoken love, and she understood, finally and entirely and forever, the whole true shape of the man, the coldness that had only ever been a grief wearing armour, the patience that had only ever been a devotion with nowhere on the earth it was permitted to go, the 11 long years through which he had carried a single faded ribbon next to his heart because it was the one part of her he had been allowed in all that time to hold. She was still standing there, the tears running unheeded down her face, when he found her. He went very still in the open doorway, and for the second time since ever she had known him, the Duke of Hawthorne looked plainly, nakedly, afraid. "I had meant," he said very low, "for you never to see this room. I am aware of how it must appear to you. A man who keeps such a room as this is not, I know, He stopped, his jaw working. "I have frightened you. Again." "No," Tabitha said, and she turned to him, and she crossed the small room to him, crossed it the very way a girl in a white gown had once crossed a whole crowded candle-lit ballroom, because someone there had needed her to come, and she took his 2 hard hands into her own 2 healed, whole, unscarred ones. "No, you have not frightened me. Listen to me now. For 2 years in that house I was looked at by every soul in it, and seen by not one living one. I was furniture, I was a fact of the floor, and you saw me for 11 years when I could not so much as see you. You kept the proof of me, and you waited, and you asked for nothing, and you hoped for nothing, and you loved me the whole of that time out into the empty air for a decade, and for no reward." Her voice broke clean across. "Do you have the least idea what that is, what it truly is? To a woman who was made for 2 years invisible? It is not a frightening thing. It is not a strange, dark, or shameful thing." She pressed his 2 hard hands hard against her. "It is the only thing I have ever, in the whole of my life, wanted." "I have loved you," he said. And the words came tearing up and out of him, raw and broken, and 11 years in the saying. Since the very moment I first saw you cross that room, every single day since has been an exercise in restraint. I told myself it was madness, that you were a memory I had gilded in the dark, that no living woman could be the thing I had made of you in my own mind. And then I saw you upon those steps, ruined and grey, and upon your knees, and you looked up at me with the very same eyes, and I knew in that instant that I had been right the whole 11 years, that it was always, only, ever you, that it will only ever be you until the day I die. Then ask me, Tabitha whispered, properly, as I am now, free and whole and choosing, with a house of my own behind me to leave, and the whole wide open world before me, and no need of you nor of any other living soul at all. That is when I want you to ask me. Ask me now. And the most feared man in all the north of England, the Duke of Hawthorne, who had not bent his knee to any living soul in the whole long course of his life, went down upon one knee before her, there in the small still room that held his 11 years of silence, went down upon his knee before a woman who had herself been forced to her knees for 2 long years, and who stood now free and unowned and unafraid, and chose of her own will to stay. And he asked her. And Tabitha Merrow, who had knelt upon cold stone in the dark for a woman who hated her, and who stood now in the warm gold of a summer evening, unowned, unafraid, entirely free, said yes, not because she had anywhere left in all the world to go, for she had a house and a fortune and the whole bright turning world, and might have chosen any road of it that she pleased. She said yes, because of every single road and every single choice, the world had at last laid open and free before her feet. She looked upon the whole of them, and she chose him. They were married at Hartcombe, in the deep gold of that following autumn, in the small grey country church where her father lay at his long rest, and the very same society that had stood by and watched her scrub the front steps 2 winters before and said nothing, now sat in those same pews in its Sunday best and watched her become a duchess. And not one single soul among the whole of them dared so much as to whisper. The Dowager Countess of Foxley wept fiercely and without one word of apology in the very front pew, and pronounced it, afterward, the only sensible thing her great-nephew had done in 20 years. Mrs. Tolly, the cook, and young freckled Annie, the housemaid, both of them brought now into Tabitha's own household, and kept there and cherished there forever, watched from the very back, with their aprons pressed up hard against their streaming eyes. Ursula Vane was, by that gold autumn, in a debtor's cold lodging in a far-off county, and was not so much as spoken of. Bryony was not invited, and Tabitha wore white. And when the new Duchess of Hawthorne walked back, at the very last, down the aisle of that small grey church, upon her husband's arm, past the upturned faces of every single family that had looked away while she suffered, and had eaten her stepmother's dinners, and had said nothing, she did not gloat, and she did not weep, and she did not so much as glance once to either side of her. She simply walked, upright and unhurried, and seen at last, and free, out of the cold grey world that had once made her into nothing, and through the great doors, and out into the wide, bright, endless gold of the autumn afternoon, upon the arm of the one single man in all the turning world, who had never once in 11 long, silent years looked away from her. And if you should ever, in some far year, find yourself a guest at Aldermere, and many were, for the cold house thawed and filled and learned to keep its doors open, you might notice that the Duke's eyes follow his Duchess still across every crowded room, the way the needle follows the north, and that there is kept yet in a small, still room that no servant is permitted to dust but herself a faded length of ribbon, and beside it now a second drawer, and in that second drawer the letters that she has begun, in her turn, to write to him and never send, and lock away against the day she shall want to say a thing too large for any ordinary evening. Some loves burn down to embers. Theirs only ever banked itself and waited, and burned the hotter for the keeping. He had watched her for 11 years before ever he had her. He has every intention now of watching her for 50 more. Stories like this one, my friends, remind me of exactly why I love so to do this. That feeling of escape, of justice, of love winning out at the very last against all the impossible odds, of someone overlooked and discarded and made small, being at the end finally recognized, finally chosen, and chosen not out of any pity, but because she was the whole long while and all along the only one in all the world ever truly worth the choosing. There is something in that deep, quiet longing, I do think, that all of us carry within us, whoever we are, and wherever in this wide world we each happen to be listening from tonight. The deep, old, human wish simply to be seen, to be witnessed, to have someone somewhere cross the whole crowded room and the whole long cold decade and say at the end of it, you. It was always only you. If you felt even a little of that tonight, listening, then you are exactly and precisely where you belong. So tell me, won't you, down in the comments below, what was the one moment that stayed with you and would not let you go? Was it the faded ribbon, carried in silence for 11 years? The ledger, read by the light of a single stolen candle? The black river in the dark, and the voice that broke clean apart upon her name? Or the small still room at the very end, with its 11 years of letters, written and folded and labelled, and never once sent? I read every single one of your comments. Everyone. And I should dearly love to know. Subscribe, if you'd care to stay on with me a while, for the next story I have to tell. And until that next time, my friends, take good and gentle care of your own selves. I shall see you again very soon.